I've already related that when you were with the Emperor, you could leave only when he dismissed you. If in the evening he retired to his bed and did not feel like sleeping, he had the light carried into the adjoining room and would continue the conversation in semi-darkness. One evening, I was in his room and he fell asleep without having told me to retire. For fear of disturbing him, I remained sitting in one of the corners, waiting for him to awake. I was deep in my thoughts about the destiny that had called me to live near the greatest man of the century, while my mother was in Vienna with his son, when I heard a few brief words that I did not understand. The emperor seemed to me to be having a nightmare that I ended by making little noise. He rang his bell to call Saint-Denis, who was on duty and sleeping in the adjoining room. I immediately responded to his call. He inquired whether he had been sleeping for a long time, and I told him for approximately an hour and a half. Give me my covered lamp and my bathrobe and go to bed, for it is late. It was 11 p.m. The next morning, knowing the emperor had only gone back to bed at 3 a.m., I only went into his bedroom at 7 a.m. to open the shutters without drawing the blinds. This was the way he wanted it, because full daylight hurt his eyes. I stood in front of his bed, awaiting his orders. He was looking at me as if preoccupied by something other than the object he was staring at. Suddenly, he told me he had dreamt of Empress Marie-Louise and his son, whom she was holding by the hand. It was a new experience for me to hear the emperor mention a dream. She was as fresh, he said to me, as when I saw her at Compiègne. I took her in my arms, but no matter how hard I tried to keep her, I felt her escape me. And when I wanted to hold her again, everything had disappeared and I was awakened. Your awakening must have been cruel, sire, but I witnessed your majesty's dream. I even thought from the agitation I heard that you were ill, and I was about to awaken you when you called Saint-Denis. Ah, he said, jumping out of his bed and taking me by the throat. It is you, miserable wretch, who are the reason I could not remain any longer with my wife and my son? What does your crime deserve? Confess. May heaven grant me the power to place both of them in your majesty's arms to atone for the error and obtain my forgiveness. It is enough for me to bear the burden of my misery alone without having them for witnesses, he replied, letting me go. Saint-Denis, whom the emperor was very fond of, had married a young Englishwoman who was most charming, as sweet as she was kind and pretty. She had been sent from London to educate Mademoiselle Hortense Bertrand, today Madame Thayer. The emperor was opposed to this marriage, which was a love match for Saint-Denis without monetary advantages, and which was going to deprive Countess Bertrand of her daughter's governess. He asked that 6 months go by before their wedding take place, believing the time would allow Saint-Denis to reconsider. But that time had arrived and his feelings remained the same. Father Bonavita blessed the marriage, but was strongly reprimanded by the emperor for having celebrated it without telling him about it. Once it was over, the emperor never mentioned it again. Saint-Denis found in Miss Hall a charming wife and a kind and excellent mother for his children. At the time I am speaking of, Madame Saint-Denis had just given birth to a daughter who promised to be pretty, and in fact did become so. Count de Montholon and Count Bertrand held her over the baptismal font. That day, the emperor came out of his apartment, went to sit down in his robe under his oak tree to have lunch there. When the meal was over, he said to Saint-Denis, "Call Merchant and bring me your daughter." The weather was calm and mild. Saint-Denis presented the child to the emperor, who looked at her kindly and complimented the father. Saint-Denis was naturally very happy about the interest shown in his daughter. He predicted great happiness for her future. "Go," the emperor said to me. "Bring the prettiest of my Chinese chains." I hurried there in return, handing it to him. The emperor took it and placed it on the child, saying, "May you be as happy as you promised to be pretty." The emperor showed great kindness towards all of us. He knew that our care was not limited to obeying his wishes, but also anticipating them. This chain had been previously attached to one of the emperor's watches, and he had taken it off to replace it with a chain made of Empress Marie-Louise's braided hair. On New Year's Day, 1820, General Montholon, the Grand Marshal, his children, the priests, and the doctor came to present their respects to the emperor, whom had them all stay for lunch. The first 6 months of that year passed relatively well. Work was still being accomplished, although periods of illness came to interrupt it. It was not the same in the months that followed, when all that can be recorded was a visible deterioration in the emperor's health, a long illness, and finally death. During the last months of that period, there was some discussion of Count and Countess Bertrand's departure for Europe. The Countess's health worsened in this abominable climate, but she said what dictated her return more than anything was the education of her sons and daughter. Until then, it had been entrusted to a British sergeant to teach them to write, to Father Vignali for their religious education, and whatever else to Miss Hall, who had married Saint-Denis. This could not possibly represent the education she would have chosen to give them. The Grand Marshal decided to speak to the Emperor of it and to request, not for himself, but for his wife, permission to take her children to France or England so they could receive the education that had become mandatory. The Emperor, while offering objections to this request, agreed to it only when he saw that Countess Bertrand's mind was made up. He only expressed the desire that it take place at a time he himself would decide, and that the Grand Marshal accompany his wife and children. The Grand Marshal then requested a leave of absence for 9 months to accompany his family to Europe, as the Emperor had advised him. He would settle them in London, arrange his personal affairs, and then come back to devote himself entirely to the Emperor. For anyone who has known the Grand Marshal, there can be no doubt that decision was dictated by his duty as a father and by his sincere attachment and devotion to the Emperor. At that time, Count Las Casas and his son, General Gourgaud, and Countess de Montholon, along with her children, had all gone back to Europe. If the Grand Marshal left Longwood with his wife, 4 children, and the servants, who all brought a certain animation to the colony, an immense void would ensue for the Emperor. He would remain alone with Count de Montholon, whose self-sacrifice was as exemplary as his devotion, but who was not invulnerable to an illness that might keep him in bed. In that case, the Emperor would be left on his own. His Majesty did not speak of this departure plan, which obviously displeased him, but which everyone talked about. In the months that followed, it led to some coolness. Less with the Grand Marshal, perhaps, than with the Countess. Sometimes capricious. Countess Bertrand was gracious and very attractive. Her quick and keen mind made her conversation pleasant and amusing, even during the moments of bad temper, when her mouth sometimes allowed words to escape that belied her heart, which was true. A few hours with her allowed the Emperor to pass the time his health no longer allowed him to spend on work. She did not believe the Emperor was ill to the extent that his days were in danger, and Dr. Antomarchi, who shared that opinion, supported her in the belief that the Grand Marshal could take her to Europe and return to St. Helena, where he would see the Emperor again. For his part, His Majesty was preparing himself for this isolation by seeing the Countess less often. He saw he had been mistaken about an affection he thought he had acquired. He did not complain of it, but his heart was wounded by it. One day, while the Emperor was in his bath, he talked to me about the forthcoming departure of Countess Bertrand. "It is I," he said, "who advised Bertrand to accompany his wife to Europe, both to take care of his personal affairs and to organize the expenditures of his wife, who, by her lack of care, would soon spend all his children's fortune. I pointed out to him the emptiness that would result for him." "Am I not already accustomed to it?" he replied. "The Marshal's wife does not spoil me." "It is true, sire, but the Grand Marshal is always available to your Majesty, and this house that is so often visited by the Grand Marshal and his family is going to become a desert. Your Majesty will no longer be able to look toward the camp without feeling sad." "But what can I do? I am not forcing her to leave. Bertrand himself does not see that if I let him take his wife to Europe, he will not find me here when he returns. I have only one means of keeping him close to me. It is to do for Madame Bertrand what I'm doing for Madame de Montholon." "Sire," I said, "I deeply share the Grand Marshal's feeling. I believe that he can go to Europe and find your Majesty in his return. But between now and then, I see a great deal of loneliness for your Majesty following that departure. Your habit of summoning one or the other of these gentlemen shall be upset, and through Count Bertrand's departure, you will be deprived of a resource which is that much greater, in that if you were to remain alone at Longwood, he would spend all of his time with your Majesty, as does Count de Montholon since his family's departure." I had reached that point when Saint-Denis announced the Grand Marshal, whom I left alone with the Emperor. On the desk in his bedroom, I saw written in pencil the following names in the form of a list: Duke of Vicenza, Caulaincourt, Rovigo, Savory, Ségur, Montesquieu, Daroux, Drouot, Turenne, Arnaud, Denon. I since learned it would have been pleasant for the Emperor to have one of these men close to him to replace the Grand Marshal should he leave for St. Helena. Destiny had decided otherwise, and the words spoken previously by the Emperor were to come true. The name of Bertrand is linked to mine, and as long as I live, he shall live. The man who had the most difficulty adjusting to the monotonous life at Longwood was Dr. Antomarchi. He had been seriously ill, but had recovered quickly. For distraction, the Emperor had urged him to take horseback rides around the island and walks, going to the camp to visit those who were ill and become familiar with the diseases there. These errands gave him a certain amount of independence in the use of his time. The emperor paid no attention to his walks into town or elsewhere, as long as he felt well, but they earned him strong criticism when his majesty's health required his care. I have said that the emperor no longer worked. His strength was waning, and even the wind caused him pain. The doctor felt it was necessary to place vesicatories on both of his arms. The emperor refused. "Don't you think," he said, "that Mr. Lowe is torturing me enough without your wanting to share in it?" His Majesty's trust in him was not yet established, and it was necessary for Count de Montalon and the Grand Marshal to talk to him about the excellent result Dr. Antomarchi's proposal might have before he would agree to it. Thus, one morning he offered his 2 arms, but his repugnance was evident. The doctor placed one on each arm. However, these vesicatories had no shape, that instead of being round or oval, they were simply square. The emperor expressed his surprise when they were applied and complained that the spots had not been shaven. Remaining in bed, he was bothered by them all day, which put him in a bad mood. He told Count de Montalon to go take a walk around the camp and requested that I read to him. He had difficulty using his arms for dinner, and this made his mood even worse. He had called for the doctor several times, but each time was told he had not returned from town. The Grand Marshal came. He complained of being badly cared for and of having both arms encumbered, so he could not move. On returning to Longwood, the doctor was shown in and asked the emperor how he felt after the application of the vesicatories. "I don't know," the emperor answered brusquely. "Leave me alone. You place vesicatories that have no shape. You do not shave the place before applying them. This would not be done to the poorest man in a hospital. It seems to me that you could have left one of my arms free without affecting both arms. That is no way to tie up a poor man." The doctor wanted to reply. "Go away," he said. "You are an ignoramus, and I a greater one for having let you do this." When the vesicatories were removed, they had some result and brought his appetite back. After a few weeks of bandages, they dried up by themselves. For the past 15 months, the creation of the gardens had provided the emperor with daily occupation and exercise for his body and legs, but now, with the bad weather, his health declined. Father Bonavita gave the doctor a serious enough scare that the emperor invited the clergyman to return from Europe. Gentilini, head boatman on the island of Elba, had asked to follow the emperor's household to Paris as a footman and was in St. Helena in this capacity. But he was suffering from a chest ailment to such a point that the emperor decided he should return to Elba, his homeland. Both of these men put off their departure, which only took place the following year. The emperor's days were spent partly inside his apartment, which he kept closed part of the day. If he went out, it was to get into his carriage or to stroll through the garden, sit there and spend an hour in the company of Count de Montalon or the Grand Marshal. Countess Bertrand herself was ill and rarely came, while her young Arthur was also ill and being treated for a liver ailment. The emperor's lethargic state increased daily. If he came back from a stroll, the air had been bad for him. He would go into the billiard room and have everything shut tightly. Count Bertrand and Count de Montalon relieved each other, and in their absence, I remained with him. His appetite had disappeared. Nothing appealed to his sense of taste. He would eat only roast and was served the crispiest part. He would extract the juice without being able to swallow the meat. His bouillon tasted good only if it was reduced to juice, which was bad for his digestion. He received the doctor without telling him any of what he felt. The latter did not hide the seriousness of the emperor's condition. He told Count de Montalon and the Grand Marshal, assuring them that should the emperor continue in this way, he would not live more than 3 months. It was necessary to apply a cautery as soon as possible. These gentlemen insisted with so much perseverance that they convinced His Majesty to have one placed on his left arm. At first, his cautery seemed to have the effect the doctor expected. After a few days, his appetite returned a little, and the spasmodic sighs that had been frequent decreased. One day he felt he had been poorly bandaged and called for the doctor during the afternoon, but Saint-Denis came to say he'd gone into town. "He could at least," said the emperor, "let us know when he goes there, so I'm not left alone in my current state of health." His Majesty waited another hour, then, aggravated by the pain he felt, told me he wanted to change the bandage himself. All his flannel shirts had been opened, and it was easy to reach the wound by removing his robe and rolling up his shirt sleeve. I had watched this bandage changed every day and was sure I could do it myself. I prepared everything that was necessary, and assisted by Count de Montalon, who held the emperor's arm, I removed the bandage and took away the patch that had become quite saturated. I washed the wound by placing a small silver basin under the arm, applied a fresh patch, then a small piece of cloth folded in for a bandage, and a strap holding everything together. The emperor felt relieved. I noticed that the wound, instead of being red, was purple in color. The emperor was pleased with the experiment that had just been performed, and to have been able to do it without the doctor. "In the future," he said to me, "you shall change my bandage. I no longer want him to touch me." and I continued bandaging him myself every day until the last days of his life, when this cautery dried up completely.